Trade Minister Vealja, whose crystalline form refracted the room's light into prismatic patterns, chimed in with what could generously be called laughter. Perhaps they misunderstood our request for their finest diplomat. This appears to be their finest elementary school student. Station Commander Gorvak clicked his mandibles in what passed for Manthari amusement. His compound eyes, each capable of processing 1,000 different visual spectrums simultaneously, somehow failed to see the irony of his own situation. The human designation reads Kira Voss, age 19, junior diplomatic attaché. Junior. They have sent us a junior representative to negotiate the most significant trade agreement in their species' history. Kira Voss, the subject of their collective derision, sat perfectly still in her chair, hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore the standard Earth diplomatic uniform, a simple navy blue jacket and skirt that looked positively primitive compared to the flowing robes, ceremonial armor, and bioluminescent accessories adorning her alien counterparts. Her brown hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her green eyes held an expression of polite attention that her critics mistook for naive wonder. The truth, as is often the case with cosmic jokes, was far more complex. "I suppose," Kira said in a voice that carried just enough of a youthful tremor to be convincing, "I should begin by thanking you all for this opportunity. Earth is very excited about the possibility of joining the consortium." Threx's pheromone glands released what could only be described as olfactory condescension. "Excited, yes. We imagine your primitive world must be quite overwhelmed by the prospect of interacting with true galactic civilization." "Oh, absolutely," Kira agreed with such earnest enthusiasm that even the station's artificial intelligence might have found it suspicious. "We've learned so much just from studying your public records. The consortium's expansion into the Outer Rim territories has been particularly fascinating." A moment of silence fell over the room. The kind of silence that occurs when several very smart people suddenly realize they might not be as smart as they thought they were. "Public records." Veil's crystalline form shifted slightly, creating new patterns of refracted light that indicated either curiosity or concern. "Well, yes," Kira continued, pulling out a tablet that looked laughably primitive compared to the holographic displays and neural interfaces used by the other delegates. "Earth's Diplomatic Academy requires extensive research before any negotiation. We've been studying consortium activities for the past 18 months. Gorvak's compound eyes swiveled toward Threx, who was beginning to emit pheromones that suggested mild panic. "What sort of activities have you been studying, young human?" "All the usual diplomatic things," Kira said with a smile that could have powered a small star. "Trade route establishments, territorial negotiations, resource allocation disputes, that fascinating situation with the Helix Nebula mining rights, for instance. And of course, the recent military buildup along the Sigma Persei corridor." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, which was particularly impressive considering the station's environmental controls were designed to maintain perfect atmospheric conditions for 17 different species simultaneously. "Military buildup?" Threk's voice had lost much of its earlier condescension. "I'm not certain what you mean by that, young human." "Oh, I'm probably just confused," Kira said, her fingers dancing across her primitive tablet. "I mean, when we detected the Dominion fleet's third battle group moving into position near the Andromedan Gate, we naturally assumed it was related to the upcoming negotiations. But perhaps it's just a coincidence?" The silence that followed could have been used to calibrate quantum vacuum detectors. The Dominion fleet was not by any reasonable measure a topic that junior diplomatic attachés should be discussing casually. The fleet was the galaxy's most feared military force, commanded by beings who made the consortium's members look like particularly aggressive kindergartners. They were ancient, powerful, and had a distressing tendency to show up whenever the galaxy's power balance needed what they euphemistically called adjustment. "The Dominion fleet," Veiji said carefully, "is not a party to these negotiations." "Oh, of course not," Kira agreed. "That would be like inviting a supernova to a candlelit dinner, although—" She paused, consulting her tablet again. "I did notice that Commander Zahn's flagship, the Worldbreaker, has been maintaining a stationary position approximately 3 light-years from this station for the past week. Probably just a coincidence, though." Commander Zahn. Even the station's artificial intelligence seemed to shudder at the mention of that name. Zahn was what happened when evolution got bored with making ordinary apex predators and decided to try something more creative. He belonged to a species that had never bothered to give themselves a name, partly because they had eliminated everyone who might have needed to call them something, and partly because they considered names to be a luxury for beings who needed to be distinguished from others of their kind. Zaan was the only one of his species anyone had seen in living memory, which suggested either extreme longevity or an unsettling approach to family planning. His reputation preceded him like a shockwave. Star systems had been known to surrender rather than risk drawing his attention. The consortium had spent considerable resources ensuring that their activities never crossed paths with Dominion fleet operations, particularly those involving Commander Zaan. Unhuman, Gorvak said, his mandibles clicking in patterns that suggested either stress or the beginning of a molt. You seem to be under several misapprehensions about the nature of these negotiations. Am I? Kira tilted her head with the kind of innocent curiosity that made seasoned negotiators break out in cold sweats. I was under the impression that we were here to discuss Earth's potential membership in the consortium, specifically regarding access to the Centauri trade corridor and the mining rights in the asteroid belt of Sorrows. Those are indeed the primary topics, Threx confirmed, though his pheromone glands were now producing scents that suggested he was reconsidering his life choices. Wonderful, Kira said, her smile brightening. And I assume the consortium's recent territorial claims in the Tau Ceti system are unrelated to these discussions? This time, the silence was so profound that it seemed to have weight. The Tau Ceti system was, according to every treaty signed in the past 2 centuries, firmly within human space. The idea that the consortium might have territorial claims there was roughly equivalent to claiming ownership of someone else's backyard while standing in their living room. There are no territorial claims in the Tau Ceti system, Velsha said, her crystalline form now refracting light in patterns that suggested either confusion or the early stages of a nervous breakdown. Oh, good, Kira said with evident relief. Then those weren't consortium survey ships we detected near Tau Ceti Prime last month. I was worried there might be some sort of misunderstanding. The room's atmospheric processors, designed to maintain perfect environmental conditions, seemed to be struggling with the sudden increase in stress pheromones, electromagnetic anxiety pulses, and what could only be described as the molecular equivalent of panic. Survey ships? Gorvak's voice had acquired the kind of pitch that suggested his species' equivalent of a stress response. Well, they were broadcasting consortium identification codes, Kira explained, her tone suggesting she was merely clearing up a minor confusion. But as you've just confirmed, there are no territorial claims in that system. They must have been lost. Space is so vast after all. Ships get confused about their location all the time. At this point, a reasonable observer might have expected one of the consortium representatives to terminate the negotiations, claim sudden illness, or perhaps initiate their species' equivalent of a strategic retreat. Instead, they made what would later be remembered as one of the most catastrophic diplomatic blunders in galactic history. They decided to double down. You, human, Threx said, his voice carrying the tone of someone explaining basic concepts to a particularly slow child. Perhaps we should focus on the simple matter at hand. Earth wishes to join the consortium. We are prepared to offer your species junior membership status, with limited trading privileges and, naturally, appropriate oversight to ensure your compliance with consortium standards. How generous, Kira said, and for the first time since the negotiations began, her smile seemed to contain something other than naive enthusiasm. And what exactly would this oversight entail? Standard protocols, Velisha chimed in, her crystalline form flickering with what might have been confidence. Consortium inspectors would need regular access to Earth's facilities, of course, and your military forces would need to coordinate with consortium security forces to ensure regional stability. Regional stability, Kira repeated, as if testing the phrase. You mean like the stability you've brought to the Vega colonies? The Vega colonies had been a thriving collection of independent worlds until the consortium had decided they needed protection from unspecified threats. They were now a thriving collection of consortium-controlled mining operations and military installations, with most of the original colonists relocated to more suitable worlds that happened to be considerably less suitable for human habitation. The Vega situation was a complex matter, Gorvak said, his compound eyes now swiveling in patterns that suggested either agitation or the beginning of a seizure. Complex, yes, Kira agreed. Especially the part where the colonists' requests for aid against pirate attacks were answered by consortium forces, who then decided the colonists were the security threat. That is a gross oversimplification, Threx protested, though his pheromone glands were now producing scents that suggested he was considering whether there might be an escape pod with his name on it somewhere on the station. Is it? Kira consulted her tablet again. According to the Vega Colonial Defense Force's final transmission, they were informed that their resistance to consortium protection constituted an act of terrorism against galactic peace. The transmission was cut off mid-sentence, which I suppose could be considered a technical difficulty rather than evidence of anything unfortunate happening to the person sending it. The room's environmental systems gave up entirely and began producing what could only be described as the atmospheric equivalent of a nervous breakdown. It was at this precise moment that the universe decided to reveal the true scope of its sense of humor. The conference room's main display screen flickered to life, showing the approaching silhouette of a ship that made the station's impressive architecture look like a child's toy. The Worldbreaker was not so much a spacecraft as it was a mobile violation of several fundamental laws of physics, held together by advanced technology and what appeared to be pure malevolent intent. "Ah," Kira said with the kind of casual tone one might use to comment on the weather. "It looks like Commander Zahn has decided to join our discussion." The consortium representatives turned to stare at her, with expressions that suggested they were rapidly revising their assumptions about human intelligence, Earth's diplomatic capabilities, and the fundamental nature of reality itself. "You knew he was coming," Velsha said, her crystalline form now refracting light in patterns that suggested the early stages of a complete psychological breakdown. "Well, of course," Kira said, her innocent smile returning. "Who did you think I was really negotiating with?" The conference room door opened with a soft hiss that somehow managed to sound ominous. Commander Zahn entered with the kind of measured stride that suggested he was accustomed to having gravity rearrange itself around him rather than the other way around. Zahn was tall enough that the room's ceiling seemed to develop a personal grudge against him. His species had evolved past the need for many of the features that other beings considered essential, such as visible eyes, obvious respiratory systems, or what could be conventionally called a face. Instead, he possessed a smooth, angular head that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle of observation, as if reality couldn't quite decide what he was supposed to look like. His presence filled the room with the kind of silence that occurs when the universe pauses to consider whether it's made a terrible mistake. "Honored representatives of the consortium," Zahn said, his voice carrying harmonics that suggested he was speaking in several dimensions simultaneously. "I trust your negotiations with the human representative have been enlightening." Threx, Velsha, and Gorvak exchanged glances that conveyed entire conversations about the relative merits of immediate surrender versus ritualistic suicide. "Commander Zahn," Threx managed, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had just realized they had been playing chess with someone who had been playing four-dimensional chess while simultaneously conducting a symphony and solving quantum equations. "We were not aware that the Dominion fleet had any interest in these trade negotiations." "The Dominion fleet," Zahn replied, "has interests wherever the balance of galactic power is threatened by incompetence, corruption, or the kind of spectacular overreach that would make lesser beings cringe with embarrassment." His attention turned to Kira, who met his gaze with the kind of calm confidence that suggested she had been expecting this moment. "Miss Voss," Zahn said, and his voice carried what might have been respect, if beings like Zahn were capable of such mundane emotions. "Your analysis of the current situation is both accurate and thorough. The Dominion fleet has indeed been monitoring consortium activities with growing concern." "Thank you, Commander," Kira replied, her earlier facade of naive enthusiasm evaporating like morning mist. "I trust our intelligence regarding the consortium's illegal territorial expansions and military buildup has been useful to your strategic planning." The consortium representatives stared at her, with the kind of expressions typically reserved for witnessing the heat death of the universe in Fast Forward. "Quite useful," Zahn confirmed, "particularly the information regarding the planned annexation of 17 independent star systems under the guise of protective oversight." 17? Gorvak's voice cracked. "We haven't planned to annex 17 systems." "No," Kira said, consulting her tablet one final time. "You've planned to annex 23, but you've only managed to begin preliminary operations on 17. The other 6 are still in the planning stages, waiting for the outcome of these negotiations to determine whether Earth would provide a suitable launching point for extended operations into what you've designated as the primitive zones." The silence that followed was so complete that it seemed to have achieved a kind of philosophical purity. "Huh," Veil Shah's crystalline form was now refracting light in patterns that suggested complete cognitive collapse. "How did we know?" Kira asked, her smile returning with interest. "Well, it turns out that when you spend 3 centuries convincing yourselves that you're the smartest beings in the galaxy, you tend to develop some rather sloppy operational security habits. Also, it's amazing what you can learn when you actually bother to translate the warning messages that less advanced civilizations have been sending for the past 50 years. Zahn's attention shifted to the consortium representatives, and the room's temperature seemed to drop several more degrees. "The Dominion fleet has reviewed the evidence provided by Earth's intelligence services," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that suggested finality. "The consortium's activities constitute a clear violation of the Galactic Stability Accords, the non-interference principles, and what we diplomatically refer to as common sense." "Commander," Threx began, his pheromone glands now producing scents that suggested complete biological surrender. "Surely there has been some misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding," Zahn interrupted, "was your assumption that your activities had gone unnoticed, or perhaps your belief that beings who achieved interstellar travel were inherently less intelligent than those who achieved it earlier." He turned back to Kira, and what might have been approval entered his voice. "The Dominion fleet recognizes Earth's contribution to galactic security and stability. We also recognize the exceptional diplomatic and strategic capabilities demonstrated by their representatives." Then, in a gesture that would be discussed in diplomatic circles for centuries to come, Commander Zahn of the Dominion fleet, the being who had never bowed to anyone or anything in recorded history, inclined his head in a formal gesture of respect to a 19-year-old human girl. "Miss Voss," he said, "the Dominion fleet would be honored to propose Earth for immediate full membership in the Galactic Security Council, with all accompanying rights and privileges." The sound of the consortium representatives' worldviews collapsing was audible to anyone with the appropriate sensory equipment. "That's very generous, Commander," Kira replied, her tone suggesting she was accepting an invitation to tea rather than a position among the galaxy's most powerful civilizations. "Earth would be pleased to accept, assuming the consortium has no objections to this arrangement." All eyes turned to Threx, Vaisha and Gorvak, who were discovering that there are some diplomatic situations where the only appropriate response is what their species would later designate as strategic groveling. "No objections," Thrax managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "No objections whatsoever." "Excellent," Kira said, standing and smoothing her primitive Earth uniform. "Then I believe we can consider these negotiations successfully concluded. The consortium will of course be withdrawing all territorial claims in human space, ending all hostile surveillance activities, and providing full reparations to the Vega colonies and other affected worlds." "Of course," Valthessa whispered, her crystalline form now refracting light in patterns that suggested complete psychological defeat. "Naturally," Gorvak added, his compound eyes no longer able to focus on anything in particular. Commander Zahn observed this exchange with what might have been satisfaction. If beings like Zahn experienced such mundane emotions, "The Dominion fleet will be monitoring the situation to ensure compliance," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that suggested this was not a request. "We trust there will be no further misunderstandings." As the consortium representatives filed out of the conference room with the defeated posture of beings who had just learned that the universe had a sense of humor and they were the punchline, Kira gathered her primitive tablet and prepared to leave. "Miss Voss," Zahn said, his voice carrying what might have been curiosity. "One question, if you would permit it." "Of course, Commander. How long has Earth been aware of the consortium's true activities?" Kira's smile returned, bright enough to power several small star systems. "About 3 years," she said. "Right around the time we realized that the trade negotiations were actually reconnaissance missions, and the cultural exchange programs were really intelligence-gathering operations. Earth's intelligence services aren't as primitive as most species assume." "And the decision to send someone of your apparent age to these negotiations?" "Psychological warfare, Commander. Nothing disrupts the plans of beings who consider themselves intellectually superior quite like being outmaneuvered by someone they've dismissed as a child." Zahn's angular head shifted in what might have been approval. "Your species shows promise, Miss Voss. The galaxy may be more interesting with humanity fully engaged in its affairs." "We certainly hope so, Commander, though I suspect the consortium might disagree." As Kira left the conference room and headed for the docking bay where her transport waited, she reflected on the morning's work. The consortium had been neutralized, Earth had gained a position of unprecedented influence in galactic affairs, and she had managed to do it all without spilling a single drop of coffee on her uniform. Behind her, the Nexus Prime's artificial intelligence was already processing the news that would spread across the galaxy within hours. Earth, the supposedly primitive world on the edge of civilized space, had just outmaneuvered three of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations with a diplomatic strategy so elegant that it would be studied in academies for generations to come. The universe, in all its infinite wisdom and cosmic humor, had delivered another perfectly orchestrated joke. The consortium had spent 3 centuries convincing themselves they were the pinnacle of galactic civilization, and it had taken one young human with a primitive tablet and a talent for asking uncomfortable questions to prove them wrong. As her transport departed Nexus Prime, Kira looked back at the gleaming station and wondered if the consortium representatives had figured out yet that the junior diplomatic attaché they had dismissed so casually was actually the youngest person ever to graduate from Earth's Advanced Strategic Intelligence Academy. Probably not, but they would eventually. After all, they had plenty of time to think about it while they were explaining to their respective governments how they had managed to lose a galactic power struggle to a species that had only discovered faster than light travel 50 years ago. The universe, it seemed, was still laughing. The universe, in all its infinite wisdom and cosmic humor, had a peculiar way of arranging the most delicious ironies. Take, for instance, the Zentharian Trade Consortium's newest diplomatic station, Nexus Prime, a gleaming testament to advanced civilization that somehow managed to house the galaxy's most spectacular collection of arrogant buffoons. Floating in the neutral zone between 17 different star systems, Nexus Prime was where the galaxy's self-appointed elite gathered to divvy up trade routes, resources, and the occasional primitive species that wandered too close to their sphere of influence. The station itself was a marvel of engineering, crystalline spires that could slice through space-time, gravity wells that defied 3 different schools of physics, and a central hub that rotated faster than most planets spun. It was by any measure impressive. What wasn't impressive was the intellectual capacity of its current occupants. The Zentharian Trade Consortium had spent the better part of 3 centuries convincing themselves they were the pinnacle of galactic civilization. Their members included the Korthani, reptilian beings who communicated through complex pheromone patterns, and considered themselves master strategists, despite losing their last 4 territorial disputes. Then there were the Zephirites, crystalline entities who processed information at the speed of light, but somehow always arrived at the wrong conclusions. The Manthari rounded out the triumvirate of cosmic incompetence, insectoid creatures with hive minds that functioned about as well as a committee of caffeinated toddlers. And now, in their boundless wisdom, they had decided to graciously allow humanity into their little club. The catch? They had to negotiate with Earth's representative first, which brings us to the cosmic joke currently unfolding in Conference Room Omega 7, where Ambassador Threx of the Korthani delegation was examining what appeared to be a child with the kind of bewildered expression typically reserved for unsolvable mathematical theorems. "This cannot be correct," Threx hissed, his forked tongue flicking out to taste the air for deception. "The humans have sent us a hatchling."